Thank you to those of you who have joined us for establishing your asking rights for your nonprofit. We'll wait another minute or two for more attendees to join and then start the webinar. Doug, if you wanted to start us off, I'll just logistically to let you all know, we are recording this webinar and it will be uploaded to the City of Auburn Library for viewing if you do have to leave early. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and Tom will leave time at the end to answer those questions. And I will hand it to you, Doug.
Thank you very much and welcome. I'm Doug Lean, the Economic Development Manager for the City of Auburn. Today's program, Establishing Asking Rights, is designated for the nonprofit business sector and will focus on earning the right to successfully ask for money. We hope this information will help you and how to work together to become a stronger organization. Valuable insights that will come from here that hopefully will continue to reach your donors and thrive, help you reach your donors and thrive even during these unusual times. We often hear about the importance of supporting your small businesses, but our nonprofits play a valuable role in building and maintaining a thriving community. Your organization offers critical services that not only contribute to the health and economic stability of our residents, but also strengthen us by lifting the voices of people that you serve. I thank you for your continued support of the community and hope today's webinar will give you the tools to continue and expand your great work. At this time, I'd like to introduce Tom Ralzer with Convergent Nonprofit Solutions. He has worked with nonprofit organizations of all kinds, from Chamber of Commerce's to national museums to rural health networks and local youth organizations and international research institutes. He pioneered the concept of applying return on investment, ROI, principles to nonprofit fundraising. He holds the Chartered Financial Analyst designation, which provides the framework for investment-driven model of fundraising. He specializes in utilizing non-for-profit concepts in the methods to be used by nonprofits around the world. He has helped nonprofits raise over $1.6 million in the 25 years that he has worked with those organizations. At this time, I'll turn it over to Tom and hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for letting us come into your offices, your homes, and hopefully we can share some things. And I'll start by saying that, and build upon last week's webinar with Andy Coe, what we're going to talk about today for the next hour or so is probably very different than you're used to. We come from, and my background is finance, and I come from a place of being asked for money, not asking for money, and that has shaped a lot of how we do things. My background, just a little bit, raised a lot of money, been in the business a long time. The things we'll talk about are a little different in terms of the terminology we'll use. I'll use terms like investor instead of donor. I'll use investment instead of donation. And I think that's going to be the good entree into some of your success in the future, especially in the COVID environment that we're in right now. wrote a few books over the last number of years. I started out with ROI for Nonprofits. That was the first book of its kind, and to the point, or to the level where I was accused of committing nonprofit blasphemy because you couldn't use return on investment and nonprofit in the same sentence. That was back in 2007. Things have certainly changed since then. Those of you that get grant funding now, there's usually a return on investment section that you have to respond to in your grant application or the follow-up report. So the other thing that morphed into asking rights, and I'm going to explain what that is and some of the parts of that today, what it actually means. I'm actually going to put some pages from that third book, the Developing Your Asking Rights, which is just actual workbook. I'm going to use some of those to show you some of the things we go through when I do workshops. And then this is the latest book. It just dropped this past week, the 5-Minute Fundraiser. It's the concepts of asking rights, but asking rights is a rather technical book. This is a parable. This is a story. Some of you may remember the 1-Minute Manager, and that's been many, many years ago. It's a story. It's easy to read. It's a quick read. This is a 90-minute read of the same concepts, and people seem to really like it, the advanced copies we sent out. So we're going to talk a little bit about those same concepts today. We have worked with all types of organizations, so no matter what arena you're playing in these days, we've probably worked with them, or I have worked with them personally. I've raised a lot of money for people, pets, places, artwork, the abused, the homeless, the hungry, the sick, the religious, you name it. We've probably done it. Some of the more interesting ones, actually raised money for a monastery before. And these were the Trappist monks, and they don't talk a lot. So you can imagine some of the challenges we had to face there. 3 things we're going to talk about today, and they were online when you signed up for this. The first part, we're going to talk about some of the best practices that we've come across and honed and finessed and improved over the years we've been doing this. Then we're going to talk a little bit about developing your asking rights, define them, what it means, how to improve them. Lastly, we're going to talk about developing outcomes that are valued by investors. And I think you'll see how these fit together really well into a cohesive message. First, this is something we truly believe. This is from a collateral piece in our business from almost 20 years ago. I truly believe it. But if your organization doesn't demonstrate value, there are a lot of choices out there for investors and a lot of organizations for investors to give their money. And although we hope investors recognize the good work you do and the value you bring to the table and the asset you are to the community, sometimes we have to be painfully obvious. And that's what this message conveys. You've got choices. Don't be shy. Get your impact out there. A more in-your-face way to say the same thing is this international symbol for no over the word charity. You'll never hear me use that word. You'll hear me use nonprofit. But charity as a word has a lot of baggage, and it's not good baggage. And it really goes against the principles that we're going to talk about today in terms of why people give money to nonprofits and earning the right to successfully ask for money. Our experience has been this. You've got to speak the language of your targets. Those people, corporations, foundations that you're going after, you've got to use the language that they're used to, not the language that is part of your environment. You've got to hold yourself to the same standards that they're held to, for instance, in their business. And lastly, you've got to, and this is what a campaign really is, you've got to eliminate the excuses for not investing. That's really what happens in the trenches day in and day out when you're raising money. You're eliminating the reasons for them to say no. And I can tell you, I've heard them all, and I'm gonna give you one of those stories. But you've heard them too. Come back next year. Wish you were here last month. Just gave it all away. Our philanthropic budget has been used up. We're selling the business. I'm going through a divorce. Business is down. I just gave it all to the other organization that was here before. Most of the time, those really are excuses, especially the one about the philanthropic budget. The philanthropic budget is usually anywhere from 1% to 5% in a typical company. It's very limited. 5% would be generous. Other budgets within that company are much, much bigger. For instance, the marketing budget. So if we can somehow find a way into those avenues within a company, we do it because that's where the money is. You might remember the old adage from Willie Sutton when they asked him, "Why do you rob banks?" He said, "Because that's where the money is." That's the same reason we go after different buckets of money within an organization. How do we do that? And this is a prelude to what we're going to talk about for the next hour. We utilize more than just purely emotional appeals. We try to get you to the front of the funding line by highlighting your comparative advantages. We focus on outcomes. You'll hear me use that word outcomes more than any other word today. And then we capitalize, by using outcomes, we capitalize on untapped motivations. A graphic, another way to look at this is something called the motivational pyramid. This was first put forth by a lady named Kay Sprinkle Grace. You may be familiar with her name. She wrote Beyond Fundraising and Over Goal. She operates out of Silicon Valley. Very, very well read and a fountain of knowledge. I mean, just great. She did the introduction to my first book. And this is the simplest but best way to describe the motivations of why people give money to nonprofits: capacity, concern, connection, or the 3 C's. And here's how that is graphically demonstrated. Down at the bottom, you got the capacity. And those are people, companies, organizations that have the ability to stroke a check, but that's it. Moving up a level, you've got those that are concerned about what you do, the outcomes you have. Lastly, at the top of that pyramid, you have connection, those that are connected to what you do. They may be board members, former board members, people that you serve, people that are aware of what you do, the importance you have in the community. They appreciate what you do. They would miss you when you were gone, if you were gone. And the point here is that you raise more money the higher you go on that pyramid. The problem, and this is a mistake that many nonprofits make, is they start down at the bottom at the capacity level. In other words, they go to where the deep pockets are, and those folks may have no concern or connection at all to what you do. So this is a top-down process. It's also an inside-out process. And here's another way to look at that same thing. One more level, the connection. The connection to what you do may be emotional. It may be rational. The concern may be great or not so great. In other words, light or heavy. We may have a passing concern for what you do, or be very concerned about the problems that you address in your community. Lastly, capacity. One of the nuances there is, are you asking for current income, or are you asking for wealth? Very different. The wealth typically is where the foundational money comes from. Income comes from your job or your position right now, or it was a good year in your business. And the point I want to make with this again is that it's a top down. We start with those that are most connected to what you do. Move down, then the next concentric circle out would be those that have a concern for what you do. And really what a campaign is moving people up 1 or 2 levels. If we can move the people that have the capacity but don't really know anything about you up to a level that they're concerned about the problems you address, we'll get more money. If we can move those from a light concern up to a connection, whether it be emotional or rational, to the organization, we're going to raise even more money. When we can move somebody from the bottom level capacity up to a connection level, we're going to hit a home run and we're going to raise a lot of money. So keep that in mind. That's a fundamental principle here we're going to build upon. When you move from concern to connection, you will raise more money, and you can do that by your comparative advantages. Now, what do I mean by that? You can do things better than anybody else does. You may have secret sauce that nobody else possesses. You may do things more cheaply, serve more people. You may have some proprietary knowledge. All of those things are important, but your most important advantage is your outcomes. Why? Because at the end of the day, that is why people give money to nonprofits. I truly believe that. They may give it for a more emotional reason, but what do they want to see happen? They want to see things improve. They want to see the problem eliminated. They want to see that disease go away. They want to see results. They may not say it that way. That may seem a bit unseemly to them. But I believe that's ultimately why they do it. If they're not doing it because of your outcomes, then you are leaving money on the table. If they're just giving you transactional money, in other words, money that they don't have to think about, there's more there. If you can get them invested in your outcomes, you will raise more money. Another way to say that same thing, and you may not have heard this directly, but they're thinking it. Why should I give your organization money as opposed to all the others out there that are asking for it? Right now, those that have money, whether it be a person, business, foundation, family, they feel like an island of money in a sea of hands. Everybody wants it. You've got to rise to the top, get to the front of the line, whatever cliche you'd like to use. But you've got to show them why your organization is deserving of that. And again, the best way to do that is with your outcomes. From the investor's perspective, and that's the one that counts, it's imperative that you tell them what you're going to do with your money, what you're going to accomplish, which are your outcomes. And lastly, something you may not have thought about. What does it mean to me? Now you'll see the 3 letters there, they say OVP. OVP, and we're going to talk about that towards the end, that stands for Organizational Value Proposition. And here's where that came from. Again, when I started in the business, you couldn't say ROI or return on investment and nonprofit in the same sentence. That was verboten. Had to come up with a new phrase. Came up with Organizational Value Proposition, which is broader than an ROI concept. And that's what an OVP does. Too often, ROI in the nonprofit world simply stands for how much money did you raise at your event versus how much the event cost to put on. And that is return on investment. But we want to encompass all the value that you deliver. And that is reflective of your outcomes, not how much it costs to put on the event. What we hope to do, and what I hope you take away from all of this, is that we want to move you from that potential pigeonhole of fuzzy charity into something of a more bold investment. We want you to forget the emotional and we're the charity, we need your help. We want you to be an investment, a community asset that's valuable. That's where the money is. Now, conventional wisdom will say this: giving is an emotional act. Many of you have probably heard that. It's in the AFP curriculum, Association of Fundraising Professionals. There's quite a controversy on that. I'm at the forefront of that because I believe it's more than that. In fact, debate played out in the Chronicle of Philanthropy a number of years ago about this when the first book came out. And that's true, but it's not the complete truth. AFP will say this, again, Association of Fundraising Professionals. There's two basic reasons. They give for selfish motives. That's an exchange relationship. That's an economic relationship. I'll give you something, I expect something of equal or more value in return. Or they give for completely altruistic reasons. They want to make the world a better place. Now that's pretty distilled and it's pretty simplistic. But if you look at it this way, there's an emotional universe, there's a rational universe. They're not separate. They do overlap. And where they overlap is where you should be playing when you're raising money. Now, the three letters you see there are IDM, that stands for investment driven model. That's our version of how we do that. In other words, we're asking you to invest for certain outcomes. And where we raise the most money is where we play where those two different universes of appeals overlap. Another way to say this, and I agree with it most of the time, is that you might be able to get folks interested initially because of the emotional appeal. But you'll, at some point, if you're asking for enough money, get to that rational level, that rational side of the brain, and you'll have to give them more than just emotional appeals. Again, they do overlap, and that's where you should be playing. The traditional method, which is primarily emotional, does fall short, and you may be experiencing that right now, especially during the COVID-19 era, where you can't meet with people personally, where you can't hold an event that they can attend with their friends and have a good time and so on. It's even becoming more apparent that there needs to be a better way. And if there's only one, well, let me put it this way. It is imperative that your fundraising effort does not look like this. And that's a tin cup. That's symbolic of, well, we have a word for it. It's called begging. And if this describes your fundraising strategy, it's probably why you're having some challenges. Everybody's a target. We'll take anything you can give us. Well, thank you no matter what you do. That's really not a strategy. You might be familiar with the book, Hope is Not a Strategy. That's a hope. It's sort of whoever walks by will be as appealing as we can, but we're basing it completely on emotional appeals. When you're adopting that more of that tin cup emotional approach, you're relying on the wrong motivations. And I'm going to try to illustrate why these other motivations that are out there are going to be much, much more effective for you. Keep in mind as we go through this, that it's not about the needs you have, it's about the needs you fill. The person on the street with a tin cup is only concerned about the needs they have. Investors in nonprofits are more concerned about the needs you fill. Here's what does work based on our experience. I'm going to start with where Asking Rights came from. Asking Rights, years ago, over 15, I was working in the great state of Tennessee. I was representing a youth organization. and I was interviewing in the feasibility process, which Andy co-explained last week. I was interviewing them to see if this was a program they could get behind with their checkbook. Met with the banker, it was the biggest bank in town. This gentleman had on a white suit. He had white hair. He had a black string bow tie. He had black heavy rimmed glasses. He looked like Colonel Sanders, and he wanted to look like Colonel Sanders. That was his thing. So he let me go through my presentation. And at the end of it, he said, "Son, what gives you the right to ask me for money? I don't know you, and I'm not really familiar with the nonprofit you're representing." And that was a turning point, because at that point I realized that the outcomes of the organization had to stand on their own, because that was what would get that particular organization to the front of the line, because everybody in town wanted that bank's money. So you could cultivate a very good relationship with this gentleman. You could have a personal relationship with this gentleman. You could go to his church. You could bank at and do business with him. All that would certainly be a plus, but it wasn't going to get you to the amount of money that you needed from the biggest bank in town to reach your funding goal. He needed more. And that's where asking rights came from. That's where the phrase started. It's stuck since then. And this body of work that has been built on this. So this is what asking rights really are. This is the definition. It's the ability to deliver outcomes that are valuable to investors. If you can deliver outcomes that are valuable, you have asking rights. You've earned the right to ask them for large amounts of money. And when you earn it, they'll probably give it to you. Now, there's a lot of operative words in here. Deliver, you've got to, not empty promises, you've got to walk the talk. Outcomes, we're going to talk about that at length. Valuable to investors. How do you know it's valuable to them? Ask them. They'll tell you. That's why you always do a feasibility study first before you launch a campaign. Launching a campaign without doing the proper foundational work, the feasibility study, the goal assessment, whatever you'd like to call it, it's akin to jumping into the pool and diving into the pool and not knowing how much water's there. You need to know that, or you might break your neck. And that's what a feasibility study does for you. You'll learn very quickly in that feasibility study if you've earned the right to ask them for money. So let's dive into this a little bit more. As I was looking through hundreds of campaigns, some of the campaigns did really well. Some of them not so much. Now, you can always raise money. And I won't say campaigns that we've been involved in over the years have been failures. You can always raise some money. Just like if you're in retail, you can always sell product. If you mark it down to 90% off, people are going to buy it. That doesn't mean you're making money. That doesn't mean you're going to be in business very long. So it's just like, it's like that with a campaign. You can always raise money, but if it's not the amount of money you need to deliver the outcomes that are valuable, it's not going to work in the long run. You're not going to be sustainable, or you're leaving money on the table because you're not getting all they might be able to give you. So what we did was look at the commonalities, the common denominators of successful campaigns. And it came down to three areas: the credibility of the organization, the fundraising skills they either possessed or hired, and the outcomes they delivered. If they had all three of those campaigns did really, really well. So I'd like to go through each of them. And we're now onto the second part of this webinar, which is how to develop these asking rights. So those are the three ingredients. A lot of organizations have quite a bit of credibility, but they don't have the staff to capitalize on them. A lot of organizations have crack development teams, have a good reputation, but the investors aren't aware of their outcomes. A lot of combinations here that add up to a failed campaign. You've got to address them all. And again, I'm going to actually show you some of the pages out of this workbook to show you how you might be able to explore these on your own. The first ingredient, let's talk about credibility. Now, credibility, the definition of that is the quality or power of inspiring belief. I think that speaks for itself, but here's why it's important. Here's what I term the critical fundraising advantage. Credibility gets you in the door, whether it's a feasibility study and an interview, or whether it's an actual campaign and you're in there to make an ask. Your credibility gets you in the door. Now, Andy went over a little bit of this last week, but let me go a little bit further. When you start a feasibility process, you're going to do, let's just say, 50 confidential interviews with people to see how they like your ideas, your plans, the price tags, a lot of nuances about, a lot of detail about what you want to do. If you don't have credibility, they're not even going to give you the interview. If they won't give you the interview, you can't cultivate them. And if they won't give you the interview, you can't educate them as to what you want to do and what you want to accomplish. And if they're important, no input. If they're not in on it, they won't be up on it. If they don't help write the plan, which is what you're there to help give them the opportunity to do, they won't underwrite the plan. And if enough people won't talk to you, you don't really have a campaign, or you don't have the campaign you need. So credibility, getting you in the door, that helps you. That gives you a head start. Now, this is one of the worksheets in the workbook. And I know it's small print, and I'll just go through it very briefly with you. But these are the things I would like you to ask yourself that help you define or self-assess your own credibility. What makes you valuable to your community? Can you point to things in your community that have happened or improved, or bad things that have gone away because of your particular effort? How have what you spend your time and money on improved the lives of people, animals, community groups, healthcare? Did you provide the solution, or did you help somebody else do it? When you say your organization's name to people, what do they think of? Have you received recognition from third parties? Do you have testimonials from the people you serve, your primary customers? Okay, those are the types of things to ask yourself about in terms of improving your credibility. Another facet of credibility is it based on what really counts? And this is important. We'll touch on this point again in the outcomes section. But investors are really concerned about your impact, your results, not activity. Outputs tend to focus on, are you busy? Are you doing things? Did you serve a lot of meals? Did you have a lot of bed nights in your homeless shelter? Did a lot of people come through your doors for whatever you might be doing? Provide a lot of medical assistance. Did you educate so many people through classes? Did you save so many pets? But those are outputs. A lot of organizations stop there. Those are easy to count. They're important, but we want you to go to that next level. We want you to go to the outcome level. That's what credibility really means. Not the number of children that you helped, but in this case, the number of children who were born healthy because of proper prenatal care. How many people developed an appreciation for the arts and let's go down on the arts and culture one a little. Let's dive down a little bit farther. Working with an organization right now that wants to build an arts center. There's not been one in the community. Of course, the arts community or the artistic side of the community wants it. They can't afford to build it on their own. They're going to need the help of those in the business community to do it. So we have to craft that message of outputs that makes sense, speak the language of your targets, to the business community. The business community looks at it this way. If you can make this community more appealing to people so they'll want to live here through arts and cultural events, that's going to allow me to hire more people in less time. You're going to market the community. We're in the community, therefore you're helping us. So the message to that business community is the outcome of what having this cultural and arts center will do. That's how you have to frame these things. I'll just take one more here. If you're in the training arena, you're training people with healthier habits. That message can be translated to the employers of they're going to be out sick a lot less. They're going to call in sick less. They're going to be healthier when they're there. They're going to be alert. They're not going to be hungry when they're there. They're going to be able to focus on their work. That's what means something to that employer, not necessarily how many training sessions you conducted or how many people attended those sessions. And then lastly, I want to bring up this point. Where's your credibility focused? It's been said that nonprofits have a harder time, or let me rephrase that. Nonprofits are more difficult to manage than for-profits because nonprofits have two sets of customers. They have primary customers, the people that you serve, and they have supporting customers, the people that fund them, the people that are on their board, the volunteers that help them. Your credibility factor needs to be focused to those who make your mission possible. Those are your supporting customers. The most in-your-face example is, let's say you're in the homeless community. Your primary customer is the homeless. Those are the people whose lives you improve. They don't have any money. Your credibility message needs to focus on your supporting customers, obviously. Those are the ones that give you the money to help your primary customers. Second ingredient, fundraising skills. Definitionally, it's the ability to use your knowledge effectively, and this is skills, not fundraising skills, and readily in execution or performance. Here's why it matters. Fundraising skills close the deal. Fundraising skills get the pledge. Fundraising skills manage the campaign. Fundraising skills cultivate your leadership of the campaign and ultimately gets their check. A couple things to think about as you're going through this. And again, these are just random sheets, workbook sheets that we go through. Of all the sources, and there are 8 listed there, of all the sources of your revenue, where are you? Where do you want to be? The number 4 there, special events, that's being completely rewritten in real time, and we all know that right now. A lot of organizations that we work with got over half their money from special events, and now they're getting very little, or it's down dramatically because virtual events typically don't raise as much money. I'm going to lump things like events into what I call the 3 Gs, the galas, the giveaways, the giveaways, whether it's a car auction or something else, and the golf tournaments. And now there are a lot of tournaments, obviously, triathlons, swim races, runs. I've even seen road rallies and so on. So golf tournaments is more of a broader category than specifically golf, but the 3Gs are something that rely on selling tables, rely on an entry fee, rely on the silent auction, and on a fully loaded accounting basis, they're very expensive. And it's hard to fully load, fully account for the amount of time you spend, for instance, on a gala, but it's very high. That's why we're big proponents of campaign or capital campaigns or annual campaigns, because that's the most bang for your buck. You're going to raise more money per dollar spent than you would with the other types of events. So knowing where you are and where you want to be is an important thing to figure out in the beginning. What motivations do you use? A good exercise to help you decide this is look at the 3 most common taglines or ad campaigns or messages, even the subject lines of emails, your newsletters, for instance, that you used. Are they emotionally based or rationally based? And without knowing what sector you're in, what arena that you play in, it's usually a safe bet to say the majority of them are going to be emotionally based. It's worked for years, decades. It's becoming less and less effective as we go. And I want to give you a good example of that. Too bad I can't hear you, because typically when I do this at a conference or a large group, I hear an audible sigh. Think back a number of years ago, you were watching television, you were sitting in your easy chair on your couch, and commercial break comes on, and the first image you see is the image of an abused pet, and you hear Sarah McLachlan piano music in the background. And this is the point at which most of you say, oh, I remember that. That was an emotional appeal. There's no doubt that was an emotional appeal. They showed then more and more abused pets. I get comments all the time, like, I remember that ad, but I've never watched it till the end. I had to leave the room. I had to change channels. I had to go get a ham sandwich because they can't watch it. The good news is that they remember it, so it was a very sticky ad campaign. I then ask rhetorically, how many of you got up from your chair or your couch and wrote them a check? And very few people did. So that's a case of it did get your attention and you do remember it, but it didn't monetize. It didn't allow that check to be written because it was purely based on the emotional appeal. The credibility of the organization may have then allowed me to say, I know they'll do good things with it, but they didn't tell me that. They relied on that emotional appeal, and it appears they did that to their disadvantage. The third ingredient, and again, this is the most important one that we'll talk about today, are outcomes. Outcomes are the impact you have in your customers' lives, and I say primary customer here. Again, that's the people that you serve, not your supporting customers who fund you. And this is why it's so important. It justifies the amount of the ask. Your outcomes are what will make the difference between me asking somebody for $100 or me asking them for $100,000. If the outcomes don't justify $100,000, I'm wasting my time and the person and the prospect and the target's time by asking them for an amount of money that will never happen because my outcomes don't justify it. And that's a hard pill to swallow, and I realize that. But your outcomes are what justify the amount of the ask. That's why outcomes are so important. Again, outputs, measures of activity, relatively easy to count. You probably have to count them for reporting purposes or even accounting purposes. but outcomes are what matter, and they're tough sometimes. Sometimes they're very tough, but it's the impact you have on your primary customers' lives. So let's do a little bit of a reality check here. Rhetorically again, are your outcomes valuable to those you're asking for money? If you're having a hard time raising money, that indicates the answer might be no. Or you could be asking the wrong people. Your outcomes may be very valuable, but the people that can fund you don't connect the dots, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, the only way I know to see if my outcomes are valuable to the people I'm asking, or the people that have the money, is to ask them about them. Talk to them about them. They may have some very constructive and give you the keys to the castle comments about how to get my money. If you want my money, I'd like to see this program, and this is an example. Dealing with a gentleman, a very wealthy gentleman at one point. Most of you, it's a safe bet to say, have, and there are many companies in the conglomerate, but most of you have their products in your home, or you've consumed one of them if you've eaten at a fast food restaurant. Flat out asked me, if you can't make your valuable or your outcomes valuable to me, you don't have the right to ask me for money. And again, that stuck with me. So you've got to determine that. I'm not saying and not intimating at all that you would go so far as to prostitute your mission for money. I'm saying that the way you present them, maybe there's an emphasis that you could put more on something that's valuable to that person you're asking for money. But you've got to get a handle on what they value, and do we want to put more emphasis there? Or maybe it's simply a communication problem. They're just not aware of it, or we can improve how we're talking about those outcomes. I do want to go through an example and show you what I mean. This was an example. It's a real client, former client. This organization had an elementary school given to them, and it was move-in ready. It wasn't a dilapidated building. It was a very nice building, very large, more space than they'd ever need, but they will grow into it. So they had this great facility, but they didn't have enough money to operate it. So they hired us. And in a nutshell, this is what happened. They dealt with pregnant teenagers. That was the target audience. That was their demographic. Again, I'm going to distill it down into a very simple example. They did two things. They made sure they did all they could to make sure those babies were born healthy. So they provided prenatal care. Secondly, what they did was make sure and do all they could so those girls didn't drop out of high school. So that's what I'm going to show you here. When I sat down with this group, I said, what are your outcomes? And they said, well, 200 folks came to us last year. I said, again, what are your outcomes? And they had a hard time with that because they were stuck on the inputs. They weren't even to the output level. They were stuck on 200 people asked for our help. Okay. Of those 200, so I had to lead them down this path. Of those 200, what is your value add to those 200? What is your secret sauce? What is your outcome that's going to make people give you money for this program, for this organization? Okay. 200 come in the door. We work with them for 6 months. 100 pass the GED exam. Okay, that's your output. That's not your outcome. So 100 pass the test, great. What's the downstream outcome of them passing the test? Okay, they can now get a job that requires a high school diploma. 80%. Good. But I still couldn't go to that banker in town and say 80% of the girls that come through that program get their diploma. That was important. That might get a little bit of money, but that really doesn't mean anything to the banker. So then we add a little bit of economics, because bankers play in economics. What's the value of that outcome to that banker? If 80 of them get $25,000 a year jobs, 80 times 25,000 straight line arithmetic is 2 million in new earnings injected in the economy. Add economic multipliers to that, I could probably bump that number up legitimately to almost 4 million. So there's $4 million of economic activity happening that can be directly tied to this organization's outcomes. And of that 4 million, based upon Mrs. Banker, your market share, which is what, 23%? You're going to get 23% of that business in terms of checking accounts, savings accounts, car loans, maybe mortgages down the road, maybe personal loans. So now we've related that outcome to what they're most concerned with when they go to work every day, which is their market share and their bank. And this works beautifully. We didn't rely on, if you don't give us money, these girls are going to have very unhealthy babies and they're going to drop out of school, which may very well be true, but that's not going to get that banker interested in supporting this. Third part, and I'm going to go a little bit faster here. Developing outcomes that are valuable to investors. Going about how to do this. Think about it this way. What are your buckets of value? And I use the term buckets because it's typically an organization has anywhere from 3 to 6 pretty good sized buckets. When we're doing an OVP or an organizational value proposition for a client, we try to get it down into 3 to 6. More than 6, that's too much to explain to somebody. If it's less than 3, you don't have enough broad appeal for broad-based fundraising. So we try to get to somewhere between 3 and 6 of the buckets of value. And think about what your buckets of value might be. And this is where we're going to go through what an OVP actually is. What we first start out doing is, what are those buckets of value? We then do our best to quantify them. And I can personally torture any number till it confesses, but that's not the point. If I lose people on the way, I haven't raised any money. So you quantify them to the point where they can be reasonably explained. Then you integrate that information into your fundraising in general, your asks specifically, your collateral material, your messaging out there on social media. And the example I went through previously about the organization that helped pregnant teenagers, got them their GED. We showed the impact that would have on the economy locally, and based on that bank's market share. That's what that was. That was quantifying those outcomes and put them into the language that that particular target, in this case a bank, understood and appreciated. They liked that. Other organizations that came to them for money didn't do that, and they didn't get much money. We did. So again, you've seen this slide before. It's not about the needs you have, it's about the needs you fill, and keep that in mind. So on the spectrum of, we're kind of going back to motivations here again. On the left side, you've got that emotional appeal, that purely emotional, warm, fuzzy appeal. Appeals to one side of the brain. The other end of that spectrum, you've got pure ROI, customized for a specific bank based on their market share. But as you move from left to right, you start getting more, and there are examples listed there, you start getting more quantifiable. First, you'll move into outputs and you'll raise more money than with no outputs at all. If you get to outcomes, you'll raise even more money. And when you go to the level of, I can get a specific return on investment for a specific target, and you only go to that level if it's worth it, I should say. If the amount of money there might be large, that it's worth throwing a lot of resources at, that's where you raise the money. And to do that in a workshop situation, I'm actually showing you the sheet here that I would work through And you've seen these before on slides in this very webinar. But first, we talk about what you're going to do. What does that look like? What's the cost of that? What are the action steps you're going to undertake to produce those outputs? Once we get that, we go to what will you accomplish, which is code for outcomes. How do you impact your primary customer? And then lastly, it's that, and this is a tough question, what's it mean to me? Am I satisfied with that particular target? The warm feeling they get in their chest when they give money to this organization, or do they need more? Do they need recognition? Do they need a naming opportunity? Do they need mentions in your collateral? Do they want to make a big splash with your organization, possibly in the community? Sometimes they want to be anonymous. I want to walk through an actual example of going through this process. And in this case, I'm going to use an organization that has an educational component. Now, they're not an educational organization, but one of their programs for which they wanted money, needed more funding for, was educationally based. So that area of value was education. What are the action steps? They're going to increase the number of classes. They're going to hire more teachers. They might offer incentives for performance. Okay, that's how they're going to spend the money. Those are the action steps they're going to take. What's the outcome? We're going to increase graduation rates. Okay. Now, what's the value of that? One way to do it is our graduation rate is X, while and higher than the average area graduation rate, it's Y. And you can go to the next level, and the value of having that diploma or degree, because we can validate that with third-party data that says a high school diploma is worth so much more in lifetime earnings, or a college degree is worth so much more in lifetime earnings. We can show the value add. A true story here is that with one charter school that we worked with in the Southeast, their graduation rate was almost unbelievable. It was close to 99%. The local graduation rate was in the 70% range. And they wouldn't allow us to use that information. Their graduation rate was so high that the risk of upsetting people that couldn't get into that school was so great that they thought it would have a negative impact on the fundraising effort. So be careful, but typically better performance, the value add, the secret sauce, again, explains the outcomes to that particular prospect. And then lastly, does that answer fit with the overall messaging, maybe your market positioning, maybe your value proposition in terms of other buckets of value? And that was an example I just mentioned, that it was so good, their graduation rate was so good that it actually detracted from the fund, or they felt it would detract from their fundraising effort because they thought it might upset too many people. Again, this is the third time it's been mentioned here. Investors, the people that you're approaching for money, no matter who they are, personal, business, foundation, family, they want to know what you're going to do, what you're going to accomplish, and what's it mean to me. And if you can answer those, you'll end up with more money than if you only rely on an emotional appeal. Try to tie a bow around all these things we talked about today. Don't be afraid of putting your organization on the hook, as they say. Some organizations are reluctant to say they will accomplish certain things because they don't feel that they're in control of it. Let me give you an example with economic development. when we're raising money for an economic development client, we've worked with hundreds of them, we force them to say, in terms of their outcomes, what are you going to deliver with all this money? So let's say we raise $5 million over 5-year work plan, 5-year spend. What's going to come out the other end for their $5 million? Most of the time in economic development, in one way or another, it relates to the word jobs. Maybe it's diversity of the industry. Maybe it's greener jobs. Maybe it's higher paying jobs. Maybe it's just jobs because everybody left town. We need some jobs in this town. Sometimes those organizations are reluctant to say, we'll create 5,000 jobs. If they would do that, that would be great. But I do understand the reluctance to put yourself out there and say we will, because nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows what might happen. Believe it or not, a year ago, if you had said, guess what, guys, there might be a pandemic, people would look at you like, what? If you are hesitant to put yourself out there and define some of these goals, which again is completely normal, you can do it on a per basis, on an activity basis. In other words, we're not going to say we're going to create 5,000 jobs or assist in the creation of 5,000 jobs, but for every 1,000 jobs that we help create, this will be the impact. So we're not setting a goal, but we're saying along the way, every time there are 1,000 created that have our fingerprints on them, this is what the impact will be. In economic development, it's very difficult to raise money without having those types of specific outcomes to point to. It's scary, but you'll raise more money if you're willing to do that. Investors appreciate that. They have to do it all the time in their lives, in their businesses. They've got to decide, do I spend money here or spend money there? Capital investment, whatever it may be. They've got to make those decisions. And again, one of those first things I put up on the screen was hold yourself to the same standards that they're held to within their organizations. That's one of the ways you do that. Put another way, you must provide investable outcomes. And this is the last topic I want to talk about today. Investable outcomes. We've got to make your outcomes. You've got to work towards making the outcomes that you deliver as investable as possible. Now, what does that mean? These are some examples. An investable outcome has a reasonable chance of succeeding. In other words, it's not pie in the sky. You are not, if you're playing in the homeless space, you're probably not going to eliminate homelessness, but you can improve it. You can make steps. Don't bite off more than you can chew. It's got to be reasonable, and investors need to understand that. It has to have an acceptable return. Return is in quotation marks. Returns, sometimes it's very quantifiable, sometimes not so much. Sometimes you don't need to have it all that quantifiable, but in general, we've found that the more precise you can be, the more people respect it. They may not agree with it. They may say that number's too high. But that becomes a conversation that you can have, and it's typically a conversation that you can capitalize on. An outcome that can be translated into a value, whether that value is more philosophical, more of a moral value, or more of a monetary value. And then lastly, and I'm going to drill down on this last one, it allows investors to connect the dots. And by that, I mean this. Their money is the input. It's coming in the pipeline. What's coming out the other end of the pipeline are your outcomes. They need to see what's going on in that pipe. It can't be a black box. It can't be input and magically something comes out the other end. They want to understand how that works. This is an actual worksheet from the workbook I mentioned, and these are some of those questions to ask yourself. Does this initiative or does this program of work, in this case, it was a regional bank, and I'm using that as the example here. Does this outcome pass the reasonableness test? Does it have a likely chance of succeeding? Is it an acceptable return on investment? And I actually go through some numbers here. Can the dots be easily connected? And lastly, is it valued by investors? Again, coming back to, let's not spend too much time on outcomes that aren't valued. Connecting the dots, let me go through that. Here are some of the ways and suggestions to connect those dots for investors. Are there more in terms of the downstream impact? Are the downstream impacts better? And how are they better? Are there operational efficiencies that you have that if you went away, that efficiency would be lost? I don't recommend it normally, but sometimes it's very impactful. Sometimes you can make the case that if you don't get the funding and you go away, the hole that would be left in that community would be so dramatic that that's an outcome you don't even want to talk about. It's negative reinforcement, if you will, but sometimes the sense of urgency needs to be in their face. And you may want to consider that if things get very desperate. Scalability, the ability to get bigger and serve more and fulfill more of your mission is important. Those are the types of things that investors like to see. In terms of value details, and this is what I just alluded to, what if you didn't do this? To the extent of, what if you went away and nobody did this? If there's unmet demand, there's probably a cost to that could be calculated. And you will reduce that demand and have therefore a positive impact. You can talk about value of per successful outcome. What is the value of that next one person off the street? What's the next best alternative? The next best alternative may be much, much, much more expensive. So you can talk again about efficiencies there. In summary, and this will leave us about 20 minutes to talk, to take some questions. You've got to learn and got to get in the habit of keeping the investor's perspective in mind. Again, it's about the needs you fill, not the needs you have. It's about them. If you look at it as an investment, you are a community asset. They are investing in an asset. That asset needs to have a successful return on investment. And I know those are a lot of financial terms, but really at the end of the day, that's how the big money asks typically go. I will say this, if I'm talking to an organization and the CEO says, you know what, we need to be a part of this effort. But I put out a number that's just bigger than they ever thought they could afford, handle, accept. I do that on purpose because I don't necessarily want that CEO or that executive to be able to make that decision unilaterally. I want it to be big enough that they've got to take it to their board. And if possible, I want to be the one to present that to their board. In other words, I want the ask to be big enough that it's a board decision. And here's why. Number one, it might get us more money. Number two, everybody that sits on that board is there for a reason. And now I've just got 12 other folks that might be interested in this. Secondly, earning the right to successfully ask for money or large amounts of money. If you focus on and keep top of mind the credibility, fundraising skills, and outcomes, those are the three categories that will help you. Those are the three categories in the new book, The 5-Minute Fundraiser. Of course, you can't become a fundraiser in 5 minutes any more than you could become a manager in 1 minute, a la the 1-minute manager. But if you keep them top of mind, it focuses you on the right things to do. And then lastly, make your outcomes as investable as possible. Look at it from the outsider's point of view, not from the insider's point of view. And the more investable you make them, I think the better off you'll be and the more money you'll raise. And with that, I'm going to try to answer some questions, I think. I'm going to turn that back to Kristen.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. We did get one question in chat, and it was sent privately to me, and then I did also just put a message in the chat box. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just type them in there or raise your hand if you'd like to speak to Tom directly with your question, and I can turn your microphone on. But the question that was asked, Tom, you mentioned the pandemic a few times, so you may have sort of answered this question, but I thought I would go ahead and pose it to you. About midway through the presentation, you were asked how the pandemic has changed or affected how a nonprofit should interpret these three ingredients: the credibility, fundraising, skills, and outcomes.
Yeah, and that's an important part. I'm going to go back to the fact that it's a new world. It's a new normal. I know that phrase is overused. You can't hold events anymore. You can't build on that momentum that only a large gathering of people assembled for one purpose builds and creates. You can't capitalize on that anymore. That was the whole reason why there were silent auctions at events, because you build on everything and you raise more money that way. Virtual events are they're trying their best, and some are successful, some are not. But I think the ingredients here that we talked about are even more important, because you don't have that arena anymore, that format to play in anymore. So credibility becomes even more important. Getting your message out about your outcomes and the impact and the downstream impacts you might have becomes even more important, because those folks can't rely, they're not going to, probably not as many are going to hear the message that you might get at your annual gala. I knew one organization that raised almost their entire year's budget from one golf tournament. And it was a heck of a golf tournament. They invited celebrities, they paid celebrities. And it was because it was sponsored by a very large company, and each one of the foursomes had a higher up from that company in that foursome. And if you were wanting to do business with that company, you paid the $20,000 to play around a golf with them. But it was all for the benefit of this organization. They can't do that anymore. So suddenly 80% of their funding is gone. Now, what do? Well, they've got to start talking about, they had credibility, of course. They had some really good fundraising skills also. But outcomes are what are resonating with the people that will ultimately fund them.
Thanks, Tom. Doug, it looks like that was our only question. So did you have any questions for Tom? I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, I was going to ask the question. I think I asked this of Andy last week. I just wanted to get your take on it. Are you seeing human services types of nonprofits versus the arts? Are the arts being impacted more than human services right now, or where do you see the split?
That's an interesting question. I hope I don't contradict Andy. I don't think I will. But I'm going to be an economist for a moment. It depends. If you look at it that money is scarce right now, there's only so much to go around. You're going to see that if that's how you look at it, you can make the case that more money is flowing into human services right now. It's a real demand, and the cultural side might be a luxury we can't afford right now. That's one school of thought. On the other side, we're seeing just as many clients, because they're having problems too. If they're a museum or something that is a facility that relies on people coming, they can't do that like they used to. So they're hurting too. So across the board, there's pain in terms of funding. But I do think it's safe to say that the human services are getting more attention right now, simply because of the pain and suffering that's going on right now.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what we see here locally. So.
Doug and Tom, if you don't mind my jumping in, we did get a question from Monica. Monica's wondering, she doesn't understand, why is it wrong to use the word charity or donation?
And I'm pretty opinionated about that. Wrong is my term, but it's to make a point. When you make a donation, it's typically a lower amount of money. It's typically transactional. You're looking at it from maybe a tax deductibility standpoint. Charity has some negative connotations that nonprofit doesn't. Nonprofit simply means that you have a letter in your files that the IRS said you don't have to pay taxes, right? They didn't tell you how, your capitalization. They didn't tell you how to do what you do. They just say you can't operate this for your own particular financial benefit and leave you alone. They leave it up to you to figure out all the details. So nonprofit simply means you don't pay taxes, but what you do can look very much like a for-profit company as long as you don't operate it for your own benefit. We have just found that the more we focus on the organization, and that's just a construct. That's just I used to have some t-shirts printed up. I wish I had one here to hold up that said nonprofit. It's a designation, not a goal. It's simply a designation that you are one of these types of businesses. So charity just gets in the way. Donation, that's common, but we try to use the term investor because it connotes a completely new set of involvement. It connotes there's an expectation of return. And if you, and let me give you a real life example. Let's say just in your private life, there's an empty lot next to your home and you buy that lot for a couple reasons. One is the kids can play there. One is it maintains my view. Another may be, in 10 years or whatever, it's going to increase in value. So let's say 10 years go by and prices have gone up and you sell that lot that you bought for many reasons and you sell it and you made money on it. You feel pretty good about yourself, right? And if you made money on that, you're much more likely to dabble in a real estate transaction in the future. That's human nature. I'm going to relate that now to an investor in a nonprofit. If I give you money with the expectation you're going to do these good things with it, and you've thought through it enough that you're actually going to tell me what those outcomes might be or you hope to achieve, I'm going to feel pretty good about it. So I'm making an investment in your outcomes. And in 5 years, if you come back to me and said, we did this, this, and this is all the impact we've had, good things have happened with the money you gave us and allowed to happen, the good things you allowed to happen or made possible to happen, I've got the right to go back to you now because they made that psychic investment and made that psychic return on that investment. I've got the right to come back and ask you for money again. Just like you make money on the real estate deal, you're more likely to dabble in real estate again. If you get a return from that nonprofit on the reasons you invested, I'm much more likely to fund you again. Donation doesn't have that connotation. Donation means I'm going to give it to you for a host of reasons. One of them may be because of your outcomes. But what we have just found is that, and we've found and validated it every time we do a campaign, is we are going to raise more money if we focus on the outcomes that you deliver versus that donation type transaction. Go back to the example I used early on in the webinar about the abused pets and the Sarah McLachlan piano music. People remember it. In that respect, it's successful. What are they going to do next time? It's kind of a race to the bottom. They grab you emotionally with these images of abused pets, what are they going to do next time if they continue down that same path? Show pets that are almost close to death? What most people would rather give their money to is an organization that shows that they're successful and they achieve these positive things. And they did that with your money. One more thing about the investment approach, or just the vernacular. The investment approach sticks. It's sticky. It opens up a whole new host of emotions, that you made the right investment, that you invested in the right nonprofit, that you're proud of your community, that you are helping long-term, you're helping produce long-term effects then, rather than just a warm meal type of thing, a very transactional, very temporary outcome. Those things are important for the long-term sustainability of an organization. And typically a donation is a one-time thing. And I now put it this way. If you get the card in the mail that says it's December again, and we'd like a donation, and check the box, is it $25, $50, or $100? That's a true donation. Okay. And you might do it really well. People have been doing it for years, and they may have done it. You may have a wide following that do that. You'll probably raise more money at the end of the day if you focus on the outcomes and how you've impacted people's lives, rather than just a checkbox. And that's really the donation, or the difference between the donation mindset and more of an investment mindset.
Tom, I've got another question to ask you. There's another subset within the nonprofit world, and that's the social enterprise world. In our area, because of the strong manufacturing community sector that we have here, we have a few social enterprises, and that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of folks don't even know these companies are nonprofits. But have you seen any impact in that world at all?
Well, I've seen the rise of what's called the Class B corporation, which is a social benefit. It's the double bottom line organization, which is they've got not only the for-profit motive, but they've got the social impact motive. So they have to make money, but they don't have to make as much. So it's a hybrid of both. And in fact, a lot of states are promoting them, Class B corporations. That's one way that says that that's a movement. Most investors like to see this, even if it's a small amount of your total budget. If there's an earned income component, the fact that you're earning your own supper, if you will, even if it's only 10% of the budget, even if it's only operating the retail store, for instance, or a coffee shop where so much of the money is going towards, and so on. They love to see that, because they know at least that you're in that, you have a foot in that world of revenue's got to be greater than expenses. And they like to see that. So we often push to include a component of that and an expansion of that component in our program of work that we're raising money for, because it works really well.
Great. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to say thank you, Tom, and to the whole team at Convergent. The two programs have been phenomenal. The first program has already had a number of views, folks that have gone to our library and gotten into it and watched it in its entirety. So I believe that this will be the gift that'll keep on giving for our nonprofits in the region, and we'll continue to promote it out, that it's available. Josh, do you have anything to input? Okay, I got a head shake.
Nope, I'm good, and I think that was a great presentation.
Great. Any cleanup information at all that we need to put out that you can think of?
No, thank you folks very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope I hope it helps a lot of your organizations out there.
I believe it will.
Thanks a lot. Everyone have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
joining.